Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 triggered one of the fastest, most coordinated sanction campaigns in modern history. Within days, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia and other partners moved to freeze hundreds of billions in Russian assets, to isolate major Russian banks from international finance, and to impose sweeping trade restrictions on energy, technology and defense sectors. The United Nations General Assembly condemned Moscow's actions and adopted a resolution demanding withdrawal. A vote carried by a very large majority. The response to that war included targeted measures few had seen at scale in modern times. Major Russian banks were barred from parts of the SWIFT payment system. Export controls and investment curbs followed. Governments framed these steps as both punitive and strategic, intended to raise the cost of aggression and to signal that territorial conquest in Europe would not be tolerated. Those moves reshaped global trade and finance almost overnight. By contrast, the international reaction to Israel's military campaign in Gaza, launched after the October 7, 2023 Hamas attacks inside Israel, has been far more fractured. Many Western governments were unequivocal in endorsing Israel's right to defend itself after a brutal terrorist assault that killed and abducted large numbers of civilians. At the same time, a broad set of countries in the global south and many developing states voiced strong condemnation of the scale and humanitarian consequences of Israel's operations in Gaza. Humanitarian agencies reported wide-scale damage to homes, schools and hospitals, and tens of thousands of Palestinian deaths were recorded by local authorities and international monitors. That divergence produced a very different set of policy choices and diplomatic postures. The policy gap is striking. Russia faced a broad, coordinated economic squeeze from economies representing a large share of global GDP. Israel, by contrast, faced no comparable package of sanctions from its leading Western allies. In practice, Western military, diplomatic and security support for Israel increased in many ways during the conflict, including large US aid packages and expedited arms transfers, even as the humanitarian destruction in Gaza intensified. That difference in tools, sanctions on one side, increased security assistance on the other, raises immediate questions about consistency. So we have to ask, are these reactions a demonstration of a double standard? Or are these two events so different that different responses are justified? That is the central question. And it's not meant to be rhetorical. It is a real test of whether diplomats and publics apply international norms evenly, or whether politics, alliances and strategic dependencies drive outcomes more than abstract principles do. Let's start with the similarities. Both conflicts featured the use of heavy conventional weaponry in densely populated areas. Both produced large numbers of civilian casualties and immense humanitarian suffering, and both drew credible allegations of unlawful conduct from human rights groups and UN monitors. Accusations that include indiscriminate attacks on medical facilities, and forced displacement. Those shared elements are why many observers feel they should prompt similar global responses. Neutrality and the protection of civilians are universal norms. In theory, they apply everywhere. But the differences are also material and shape how states act. Russia's 2022 offensive was a cross-border invasion aimed at seizing or controlling territory from a recognized sovereign state. That is textbook aggression under the UN Charter. The sort of violation the post-1945 order was designed to prevent. The Kremlin's action cut across the basic territorial integrity norm that underwrites global diplomacy. Israel's operation, however, was launched in response to a years-long and very deadly terrorist assault by Hamas inside Israel. Many states and populations see a very different moral and political calculus when a government is responding to an attack that massacred civilians and took hostages. That context, an initial act of non-state terrorism, followed by a state military response, alters how allies weigh options like sanctions, isolation, or military support. Geopolitics matters too. Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a major nuclear power with independent military reach. Israel is a close, long-standing ally of the United States, integrated into Western defense, intelligence, and technology networks. These structural realities constrain what other states, especially Western democracies, are willing to do. Cutting off defense cooperation with a key ally carries different costs than imposing economic penalties on a major antagonist. The Global South's stance in both crises is also revealing. Many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America either abstained or refused to join Western sanctions on Russia, citing economic ties, energy needs, historical grievances with Western foreign policy, or a desire to remain non-aligned. Yet those same countries, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and others, were among the strongest critics of Israel's conduct in Gaza, with some leaders using the language of genocide and others taking legal action through international courts. South Africa, for example, instituted proceedings against Israel at the International Court of Justice in late 2023. Those divergent positions complicate any simple explanation about a north-south split. Legal framing is central to how states and institutions react. In the case of Russia, many Western politicians and jurists characterized the invasion in the strong language of aggression, and in some cases, crimes against humanity or genocide were invoked by commentators and legal experts. For Israel, the use of the word genocide has been more contested in diplomatic capitals, even as some UN experts, NGOs, academics, and a number of national leaders have used that term or similar legal language. That choice of words matters. Calling an action genocide triggers legal obligations and political pressure that can be very hard for allied states to accept without strong consensus. Economic interdependence is another key factor. Western Europe, for instance, was dependent on Russian hydrocarbons to varying degrees when sanctions were designed. The decision to impose harsh penalties against Moscow required a judgment that the political signal and strategic benefits justified the economic price. With Israel, by contrast, there are deep defense and technological linkages with Western partners. Sanctioning Israel, or even signaling an intention to do so, would have immediate implications for common military programs, intelligence sharing, and regional security calculations, especially in a volatile Middle East. Media framing matters too, and it has been different in the two cases. Coverage of Russia's invasion was often framed as a clear case of unprovoked aggression, a big aggressor attacking a smaller neighbor. That David versus Goliath narrative proved straightforward for many audiences. Coverage of Gaza has been more fractured. Frames vary between narratives of terrorism and self-defense on the one side, and narratives of occupation, collective punishment, and humanitarian catastrophe on the other. The result is polarized public debate inside many Western societies, and more limited political space for governments to act uniformly. There are also tactical differences in how the international system can respond. Sanctions are a blunt economic tool that many countries can deploy against a state producing or trading in commodities, finance, and large industrial goods. Military aid and diplomatic support are different tools, quicker to deploy in some ways, but also more politically fraught. Western states chose economic isolation for Russia and security reinforcement for Ukraine. For Israel, they chose continued security support coupled with diplomatic calls for restraint and, in some cases, humanitarian aid to Gaza. That leads us to a stark and uncomfortable comparison that has been widely discussed. In the early months of the Gaza war, civilian death tolls and the scale of humanitarian collapse were so large that some observers compared those figures to the early months of the Ukraine invasion. Whether you stress the exact numbers or not, the moral intuition for many people is the same. If civilian suffering is the benchmark for outrage and action, then why did the international policy toolkit look so different across these two crises? That question drives much of the public debate and political anger in capitals around the world. Public opinion and protest behavior reflected these differences. Western capitals saw large demonstrations in support of Ukraine in 2022. The Gaza conflict produced mass protests as well, but often aimed at pressuring Western governments to act against Israel, or to change their policy of unconditional support. Those protests frequently placed governments in the difficult spot of balancing domestic political pressures, historical alliances, and security commitments. There are consequences to perceived inconsistency. If middle powers and rising states conclude that the so-called rules-based order is selectively applied, they may be less willing to align with the leading democracies in future crises. That erosion of credibility could make it harder to build broad coalitions, whether to deter aggression, to punish major violations, or to respond to humanitarian emergencies, and could accelerate a drift toward more fragmented, multipolar world. So what should viewers think? If the principle is that civilian suffering and breaches of international humanitarian law should be condemned equally, then the differences in state responses are hard to justify purely on moral grounds. But if you believe geopolitics, alliances, strategic interdependencies, and the immediate security implications of punitive measures must shape policy, then the divergent responses begin to look more explainable. This is not just academic. The choices foreign governments make today, sanctions, aid, legal action, diplomatic ostracism, will shape future crises. They create precedents. They define what counts as unacceptable conduct, and what governments are willing to tolerate from friends and foes alike. Now it's your turn. If the standard is universality, should the world apply the same sanctions logic to Israel as it did to Russia? Or do the different contexts, cross-border invasion versus response to terrorism, the nature of alliances, and the regional security consequences, justify divergent responses? Drop your answer in the comments. Explain the principle you're using. Keep it factual. Keep it calm. Let's have a real debate. The broader point is this: international law and moral rhetoric matter, but so do alliances, strategic calculations, and the hard economics of power. Whether the world will figure out a way to square those competing imperatives, and whether citizens will demand consistent application of the rules, is one of the defining foreign policy debates of our time. If you value clear, fact-driven geopolitical analysis without the noise, subscribe and hit the bell. Post your best argument in the comments, and if you disagree with someone, challenge their reasoning, not their motives. This is NENC Media Group. New videos every other day. Stay informed. See you in the next one.